Now, today it is my great honor to introduce our speaker, Ashwini Mohan. Ashwini is from Karnataka in India, and she is an expert in evolutionary biology from lots of different perspectives. Ashwini started off her master's in ecology and environmental biology at Pondicherry University, working on the phylogeography of the Andaman keelback in the Andaman Islands. In fact, the topic of today's lecture is, in fact, on island evolution of lizards. From then, she went on to do a PhD at the Zoological Institute at the Technical University Braunschweig, I got all of those things wrong, in Germany, on the topic of diversification in insular islands and whether or not it's predictable, specifically looking at macro and microevolutionary trajectories of island radiations of geckos. Now, from then, she made the very, very excellent decision to move over to the UK, and where she was a Mary Curie Fellow here at the Natural History Museum, where I'm currently sitting, working with myself and Jeff Stryker, who is the editor-in-chief of our zoological journal of the Linnaean Society. And there, Ashwini worked on really combining and developing new methods of looking at not just molecular evolution, but also morphological evolution, and trying to unify these different fields to reconstruct the evolution of diverse clades. And from then, she's moved most recently over to Switzerland, where she is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Neuchâtel, working in comparative genomics on plants, but I think also on a wide variety of things. Ashwini has really covered a huge range of different fields and different topics and different systems in her research, but her heart is, I think, always with geckos from the Indian Ocean Islands, and that's what we'll be hearing about today. So over to you, Ashwini.
Thanks, Anjali. Yeah, that's very, very true. I would say my heart is very much still with Indian Ocean reptiles, specifically geckos. Hello, everyone. I'm Ashwini, and I'm absolutely thrilled to talk about some of this work that I've done. Actually started many years ago, but as some of you in science might know, a lot of these projects go on for a long time, but it's also very nice to go back to memory lane and look at all these photos and actually think about this presentation, because it made me very, very happy about all the work that has been going on. I'm currently a postdoc in University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, and I'm working more in the field of genomics today. But today I'm going to be showing you a lot of geckos from different islands in the Indian Ocean, because as you'll see, they're absolutely beautiful and fascinating. Let's see. Yeah. So islands have been a very important part of the whole production of the theory of evolution, the thought process. So some of the most important people like Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who traveled across different parts of the world, also made some of the most interesting observations in islands. It might be plants or animals or just ecosystems. They had many such really cool observations. In fact, Alfred Russel Wallace even went on to become a father of biogeography, which is a field that actually looks at how biodiversity is distributed across different parts of the world. How does one group of animals or plants, how do they colonize to a new area? And what are the different geographical, geological, biological, and ecological processes that sort of facilitate this whole movement and evolution after that movement? And you can also see the famous Darwin finches, where different beak shapes were associated with their diet. And this has gone on to open massive fields of evolutionary biology, where they study how ecological adaptation drives evolution. So since then, this was 1850s, right? Since then, people have been studying island ecosystems, asking many of these questions, but also many new questions, considering how much DNA technology has evolved, and even isotope dating and all the other methods that we use today in biology have massively evolved. And today we can extract a lot more information from the same kind of data that you couldn't do 100 years ago. I mean, even 50 years ago, you couldn't do that. So if you just looking back at some of these animals, like example, dodo, which has lost flight because it's an island endemic. It's one of the things that happens to many group of birds when they colonize islands. If they have no need of flying around to other parts of the world, or if they're isolated, they tend to lose their flight and they become terrestrial. They walk on land. And there are other phenomena as well where the body size changes. So here's a Komodo dragon that you see. A Komodo dragon is just another monitor lizard, but it's very famous and it's fascinating because of how its body size has increased massively, in addition to several other biological things that it has evolved, like having venom in its yeah, I blanked out. But also there are several other phenomena about extreme cases of sexual selection where you can see this male, a bird of paradise. I don't know the exact species from Papua New Guinea. So these are just a few examples of island peculiarities because they do tend to contain some of the most unique products of evolution. And some of the most important processes that is leading to or driving this kind of an evolutionary pattern and different processes that are leading to these patterns that we detect today are colonization, obviously, depending on the size of the island, the location of the island, proximity to a large mainland, and how old it is, and the way it originated, whether it is a volcanic island or a continental island. All of these factors actually influence how plants or animals are able to colonize such an island. And then what happens after colonization also depends on whether the island would have ecological opportunities for speciation, whether it has enough geographical space in a way that, the colonizing biodiversity are not competitively excluding one another. And then eventually, these animals and plants adapt, evolve, probably speciate into many different species or remain as a single species. But also, islands are very, very dynamic ecosystems. And there are many reasons for this. For example, volcanic islands have a life cycle. They emerge, then as they grow older and older, they start submerging in the ocean. So the sea level around that particular islands will seem to be higher because the island itself would be going down. And depending on which kind of island it is, it would have a life cycle or not, and the dynamic changes. So this also leads to extinction. But it could also be today, it could also be anthropogenic or human-driven extinction, which is, as many of you know, is one of the most important factors that is leading to extinctions on island ecosystems. And with reptiles specifically, very sadly, actually more than 70% of reptile extinctions that's happened in the last, I don't know how many decades, probably 5 to 10 decades, are more than 70% are on island ecosystems across the world. So it is quite sad that we are losing a lot of reptile species on islands. As you'll see, they're quite interesting and they come in many different forms and they have very, very diverse ecological roles as well. So just to talk about one of the, like a geographical factor that plays a role is changes in sea level. And here I've just made a GIF to show you how when the sea level changes from minus 120 meters, which would be the level of the sea during a glaciation cycle, when there would be a lot of ice on Earth, right? To when it's not glaciation. I mean, interglacial periods where there is no ice, which is like today. So today the sea level is at 0, but at minus 120, a lot of this land would have been connected, and there's a lot of land surfaces in the middle of the Indian Ocean that you see here would also be exposed above the ocean. So there would be more land available for many biodiversity to colonize and even hop, skip, and jump to other areas and colonize far off lands that are not really in proximity today because all of them are under the ocean. And once colonization happens and biodiversity, some groups reach island ecosystems, depending on ecological opportunity, they could diversify into many different species. Let's say if there's an island with very little how do I say, live organisms or plants and animals, and some groups colonize them, that would mean that there would be a lot of resources available for this particular group that is colonized. So it can adapt and it can give rise to really different forms, which can also be referred to as ecological forms or ecomorphs, where certain morphological adaptations aid these organisms to utilize resources which their ancestors wouldn't have had. So of course, they need to have the ability to evolve them, but also they need the opportunity and potentially lack of competition, lack of predators, or reduced predatory and competitive pressures can lead to this opening of this new gateway where a certain kind of an animal can just adapt to many different kinds of either microhabitats or diets or other ecological niche factors. And the first image that you see here is an example of anoles, which are, I think these are from the Greater Antilles, where you see a twig anole, a trunk anole, and a grass anole. So you have these morphological adaptations. That's a very clear sign of them adapting to a certain microhabitat. And this has repeated across many different islands because they had similar ecological opportunities. But more recently, there's been some more exciting studies, and in the extreme side, where you see a no almost flying off, you can. This is from a study that was actually testing something super cool, where they looked at how do hurricanes affect, these ecomorphological traits in particular species of anoles that are in these islands that are very much exposed to hurricanes, very much exposed to erratic climatic events. So what they detected was actually there was a selection towards having larger toe pads so that they had higher ability to hold on to surfaces in case of extreme winds and hurricanes and cyclones. So this was absolutely cool. And they saw this phenomenon across several different populations, several species across different islands in the Caribbean, showing that these anole populations that are experiencing increased cases of hurricanes are actually adapting and evolving so quickly and having larger toe pads compared to their mainland cousins. And geckos are no less. Geckos have adapted quite diversely in terms of ecologies in island ecosystems. So the painting that you see here is from Julian Hume, and this is a painting of an extinct day gecko from Rodrigues Island in the Mascarenes in the Indian Ocean. And this was called Phelsuma gigas, and it was a large gecko. And we don't have a single specimen of this species. Actually, we have just a few bones at the NHM London, but there's not a single specimen. And it went extinct after colonization from modern colonizers, let's say, because the Mascarene Islands in the Indian Ocean never had humans before. It was not an area where humans colonized thousands of years ago. No one had actually reached those islands until industrialization led to building of ships and exploration of different parts of the globe. That's when people reached these islands, and then a lot of plants and animals have undergone extinction after these colonizations. And this is one such example. So this gecko was apparently adapted to being active at night, but the entire group or the entire genus of this gecko, all the other related species, are active during the day. So that's just another example of how they change and adapt pretty quickly. And below here, you can also see Phelsuma inexpectata, which is a reunion endemic gecko that's licking a fruit. So a lot of these day gecko species utilize sugar sources from flowers and fruits, and many of them interact very closely with endemic plants and trees. And the one in between is a Europlatus gecko from Madagascar, which is absolutely fascinating in the way they've adapted their morphology. They're called leaf-tailed geckos in general, and the entire genus has lots of species, very diverse, and different species are adapted to different kinds of substrates. You can see species with vertical stripes, often on trees also that has a very similar substrate, or a species such as this, which looks like a dry leaf. So these are just few examples that I picked out randomly. But geckos, even otherwise, are fascinating because they're not birds which can fly everywhere and disperse quite easily, but they're also not large-bodied reptiles such as snakes that are actually quite good swimmers and can swim, if not very long distances, decent amount of distances. For example, between different islands within the same archipelago, snakes do swim, especially large-bodied snakes. But geckos tend to avoid brackish water or salt water. On the other hand, the one thing that makes geckos relatively good dispersers is the fact that they have hard-shelled calcified eggs that can actually withstand long journeys if certain amount of, I would say, protection is provided by some kind of habitat floating along with it, and such things. So there have been quite a number of very successful colonizations of geckos across the globe, and this is probably one of the key things that's aiding them in dispersing, but it's somewhere intermediate. So as a result of this, you can see high level of endemism of geckos, where a many species evolve in certain small regions and they're only found there and nowhere else on Earth. We refer to that as endemism. So you can see high levels of endemism of geckos in certain parts of the world, but in certain parts of the world, they haven't actually evolved as much, and you only see species that are recently introduced by humans. And here there's example of just volcanic islands, not continental islands, where you see the red boxes are islands which have just introduced or non-native geckos versus islands that are surrounded by a black box all have their own native group of geckos, if not the entire genus, at least a few species. But if you look at continental islands such as Madagascar, which is massive, has been isolated for a very long time, and it almost functions like a continent in itself. It has massive groups of animals completely endemic to the island. I mean, lemurs are a very famous example, but in geckos, we have several groups which have evolved in Madagascar and dispersed into the surrounding islands in the Indian Ocean. And I'm going to be talking about one such group today much more in detail, but there's more number of groups that I won't be covering in this presentation. So today I'm going to first talk about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, from where I started my island journey as a master student, as Anjali highlighted, and then move on to some of the more western Indian Ocean islands that focus mainly on the volcanic islands surrounding Madagascar. So the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are a particular type of continental islands. They're called the continental arc, four arc islands, where they're at the edge of the continental plate. So they have rise and above as two continental plates interact. Because of this, some of the water around them is also quite shallow. So they've undergone a lot of disconnection with the surrounding mainland, as well as within the archipelago. Islands have been connected and disconnected across many different glacial and interglacial periods of Earth. They're very beautiful tropical islands with high biodiversity, but also very high levels of endemicity and very high density of reptiles and amphibians. So as a master student who had never been to any island in my life before, when I went on a recce trip and went for a walk at night with my torch, I don't think I've ever seen that many snakes, lizards, and frogs in one night in my life. So that actually changed so much of my perception in terms of just how densely populated some of these islands can be. And they have quite different groups of geckos that have colonized from different parts of Southeast Asia that I'm just going to quickly touch upon in the next slides. So here I've just tried to provide an image of how reducing sea level has isolated these islands. So as you can see, the above group are the Andaman Islands, much more tightly packed together. And the one below are the Nicobar Islands, and both of them are archipelagos on their own. And the biodiversity they contain are actually quite different from one another and do not really overlap, except some commensal species, which are species that modern humans introduce either on purpose or not, like, because there's so much movement globally. Several species of geckos are found all over the world because they tend to attach to humans through ships and other means of transportation and arrive on these islands and thrive just where the humans build homes and where they live. So the Andaman Islands have a group of like the kind of endemic animals or geckos, lizards, frogs, everything else that's found in the Andaman Islands is different from the ones that are found in Nicobar Islands. Their biogeographical affinities are also quite different, where the Andaman Islands is more Indo-Burmese in terms of the origins and the species that you see. They're more closely related to the ones in Indo-Burma region, and the Nicobar Islands contain plants and animals that are more closely related, putatively more towards Indo-Sumatran region. And as I already mentioned, more than 90% of all reptile species here are endemic and found nowhere else on Earth. And there's quite a lot of primary habitat left in the Andaman Islands and the Nicobar Islands because of how it is protected by the native people, by the tribal people who've lived there for thousands of years, as well as later on by the government protecting these islands. But this is obviously changing with time, and it remains to be seen how this evolves with time. So I had this terrific opportunity, thanks to some independent funds that we were able to obtain, to go across the Andaman and Nicobar, all the way from the northern Andaman Island to the southern Nicobar Island, and stop at every island and travel around the island and document every species of gecko we can see, measure it, photograph it, collect tissues for DNA work. And I was interested in mainly some of the topics that I already highlighted before. One is colonization. Where are these species arriving from? Where are they coming from? And how long have they been here in these islands? Have they diversified and become new species, or are there more than one species? But also, more importantly, I wanted to know, how do they remain connected? So, populations on different islands, how do they remain connected if you have oceanic water between, you have salt water in between these islands? So I was very interested to look at how genetic diversity changes based on how much they're connected or not connected, and how much gene flow there is between different populations. And very interestingly, and probably quite obviously, you can see just by the geographical distances, Nicobar Islands are very far from one another, Andamans are much more attached. And intuitively, we can hypothesize that you would think populations of reptiles, geckos in the Andamans are probably having a higher gene flow, versus Nicobar Islands could have higher species diversity, because they haven't been able to have continued gene flow for probably thousands or millions of years. And we sampled for more than 7 to 8 months, and this was primarily our sampling team. And it was, well, the kind of time where I don't think it could ever repeat. And this work especially exposed me to a lot of local geopolitical issue, the dynamics between different tribal people arriving from the Indian mainland, the complexities. And these experiences were very, very eye-opening for me, who didn't have this exposure before. So from this work, even without doing any lab work, even in the beginning, we could say that depending on the species we found on the different islands, we discovered 11 new distribution records from 3 different islands, species that we knew were there in other surrounding islands, but no one had detected in those particular islands. So it was very exciting. We also detected putative new species, like the one on the top. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the Hemidactylus aplatyurus is potential new species. Um, and we also discovered other new species that other people working on reptiles in the Andaman and Nicobar described it formally in the last 2 years, which is the Nicobar day gecko and the Stolic skies giant gecko, which is also from the Nicobars. So just capturing these and measuring, and every time looking at a new gecko, we were absolutely excited with thinking about what is happening between these islands. So to continue the story, to understand colonization history, as you can see, this is a biogeographic regions map from a publication from 2 years ago now. And it adds Andaman and Nicobar into the Sunda land biogeographic region, which is the most, the popular hypothesis driven. But most of these species lack genetic data in the larger evolutionary trees that researchers are building for South and Southeast Asia. So one of our projects right now with Vidisha Kulkarni and Karthik Shankar at Indian Institute of Science is to add these species that we have been sampling to the puzzle and try to figure out the colonization histories of these different species, both in the Andamans and the Nicobars. And we have been getting some really, really interesting results. This work is still ongoing. So I would shamelessly advertise for you to keep an eye out for this work to come out in the next many months. Apart from all the Southeast Asian origin groups of species that we see in the Andamans, there is a gecko that is completely out of the box, because it's bright green in color with a turquoise tail, and it's very easily and commonly seen in coconut, betel nut, or banana plantations. And the first time I saw it, I was pretty sure that it had to be a human introduced, some kind of a commensal species that we have introduced very recently, because it's completely different from anything else you would see anywhere in South and Southeast Asia, because we don't have bright green geckos. We have other lizards in the arboreal niche that are bright green and different shades of that, but not geckos. So this species actually took me, on a very long journey and exciting PhD project, because this comes all the way from Madagascar. So Andaman day gecko which I thought was a commensal. So this is an Andaman day gecko. The rest of the species in this group, in this genus called Phelsuma, they're all distributed in the Western Indian Ocean islands, which is mainly Madagascar, Comoros, Mascarenes, Seychelles, but very, very far from the Andaman Islands. And it is not found in the Nicobar Islands. So Madagascar has more than 45 species in this particular group, and all of them different shades of green, brown, turquoise, quite colorful, uh, and very, very beautiful geckos. So the puzzle, how did this arrive to the Andamans, is something that really drove me to ask a lot of questions, because Madagascar itself, which is considered the place where this group diversified, is almost 6,000 kilometers away from the Andamans. And today, there's no land in between large enough and exposed to sort of function as a skipping stone for the species to reach the Andamans. But one of the things was that we didn't really know how the Andaman day gecko was related to all of these other species, which are distributed in Madagascar and surrounding islands around Madagascar. So the first thing we did is we added some more genetic data to some data that was already available by researchers who had worked on this group previously, but mainly in Madagascar and surrounding islands, and tried to ascertain how is this related to the rest of the day geckos group in Madagascar. And one of our findings was that it's one of the earliest species to branch off from that phylogenetic tree, which also means that it probably dispersed out of Madagascar a very long time ago. And our divergence estimates gave us an estimate of anywhere between 23 to 38 million years ago. So that's a long, long time back, much before any humans were involved. So this indeed turned out to be an endemic gecko to the Andamans, not found anywhere else in Madagascar or other island groups, or even Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, Maldives, all the other groups that you can think of which are in that particular area. There is no trace of this gecko anywhere. And within the Andamans, we were interested to look at how the species could have diversified into more than one species, or how other populations across the islands, how genetically diverse they are. And indeed, it turned out to be quite genetically diverse, and there's a gene flow between most of the populations in the Andaman Islands, except the Little Andaman Islands, where we also detect some gene flow using nuclear markers. But compared to some of the other endemic geckos, like the bent-toed gecko that you see in the bottom, right beside the green gecko here, which has a lot more genetic structure, where each island would have its own genetic, how do you say, like a haplotype, which is a form of the same gene, but different from the next island, right? So it was much more diverse from one another compared to the Andaman day gecko. So that sort of showed us that these geckos are actually able to disperse pretty easily, and also that's why they have higher gene flow. And we believe that humans could also have a very important role in this in more recent times, because the Andaman day gecko, they are very, very successful in plantations, in banana plantations, coconut and betel nut plantations. And these are the crops and products that farmers often cut, and then they ship them to between different islands, but also to different parts. So we think that humans could also have a role in the fact that they have higher gene flow compared to other endemic geckos in the Andamans. Moving on, just moving west of the Andamans, a lot west. These are the Comoros, or the Comoro Islands. These are volcanic islands. There are 4 different islands. I'm going to focus on 2 islands here, which is called Grand Comoro and Mayotte. Both of these islands have their own endemic day gecko species, which are labeled in black here. And the red species are invasive or introduced species because of humans, either directly or indirect introductions. And the Phelsuma laticauda that is on Mayotte, as you'll see in the list of species, is actually much more invasive compared to Phelsuma dubia, which is the kind of species that even if humans bring, they survive around human habitat areas, but they don't really go towards forests and take over the ecological space of the native species. And on the other side of Madagascar, you have the Mascarene Islands. And here I have focused mainly on Mauritius and La Réunion, both of them, again, volcanic islands. And they also have their own endemic species of day geckos found nowhere else on Earth, but they also have invasive species. of day geckos as well. So here, just to recap, you have endemic species of day geckos, but you also have invasive species of day geckos, which have recently arrived from Madagascar. So all of the red marked ones are invasive slash introduced species, and all of them are actually native to different parts of Madagascar. In these islands, which are relative to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, because these are volcanic islands, they have actually never been connected to any other landmass, such as Madagascar or continental Africa. They've always been isolated. So the way that colonization happens is over water dispersal. So plants and animals disperse over water through some kind of natural events and colonize these islands. And then after successful colonization, they utilize the resources, they evolve, and they adapt and they survive and they become more number of species. So if you look at Mauritius, we know from our studies that there was potentially a single successful colonization event that has led to speciation, resulting in 5 different endemic species, where one is already extinct. In fact, the species with the plus symbol, or like the Christianity symbol, is actually extinct locally extinct in Mauritius. So this is a small radiation. And I'm gonna lose my thought. What was I saying? So this essentially means that these closely related species that have undergone radiation, they survive alongside one another, right? They are found in the same habitats. Most of them actually are found in similar habitats. They can be within a few kilometer vicinity, or they can also be on the same tree or the same plant, and they still divide that ecological niche. And one of the way that they divide that ecological niche is by occupying different substrates, and especially for day geckos, they occupy different heights on the same substrate. So you can find a species closer to the ground, but as you go up and start looking at the canopy, you might see 2 other species which are occupying different heights. So they divide the vertical niche and they survive alongside each other. But researchers have also shown that if you remove one of the species, it doesn't mean that the other species does not take over the niche. If you remove a species, immediately the other species also take over that particular niche. So there is competition, but there is competition in a way that they do not completely exclude each other, but they survive alongside each other. And we were very interested in some of the processes that are underlying this. What do they eat? And does this like microhabitat niche partitioning actually reflect different ecological adaptations in terms of diet? We were very interested to study some of these aspects, but also look at how the invasive species that I highlighted previously impact this kind of a complex adaptation, where just a little bit of exclusion of one of the native species can change the interaction between the surviving species. Then what are invasive species doing to these complex ecosystems? That was something that we were really, really interested in. And therefore, like again, with I had this terrific opportunity to first of all work with amazing people, but also was able to obtain some funding to do field work in these islands, and had the opportunity to go and see all of these endemic species of day geckos, which otherwise are quite very, very difficult. First of all, they're very difficult to sample, but also very difficult to see many of them, because many of them are endangered, some of them are critically endangered. And like we have to remember that these islands, such as the Mascarenes, were so central to the formation of the idea of extinction itself. Like the whole concept of extinction sort of started with extinctions in Mauritius, Reunion, and Rodrigues, because people didn't really know that wild animals just vanished and then sort of never came back. So these are ecosystems with a long history of extinctions and human impacts that have massive impacts on the biodiversity that they have today. So it was an absolute like thrilling time of my life. And these are some of or most of the species that we were able to sample. The Robert Merton's day gecko is from Mayotte Island. The blue-tailed day gecko is from Mauritius. And then you have the island day gecko, again from Mayotte. Oops, I wrongly labeled it. Phelsuma comorensis from the Grand Comoro Island, and Pasteur's day gecko from Mayotte. So just from hearing, you know that already there are more than one species from one particular island. And even when we are sampling, we sampled more than two species, three species in the same site. So it was actually pretty cool to see how they divide their niches, not just in heights, but also there are species that occupy palm trees, but there are species that do not use palm trees, which was interesting. In Mauritius, there has been a lot of habitat degradation, even in the upland forests. Here you can see a shot of upland forest from one of the nature reserves they have. You can also see these palm trees that are all over the place, which is actually an invasive species of palm. But the blue-tailed day gecko, which you see in one of the photographs, they're actually quite well adapted to these invasive plants as well. Unlike some of the other species, the one below, upland forest day gecko or Phelsoma rosagularis, is not really adapted. They are only found in, very very dense primary or maybe slightly disturbed habitats, but they're very, very specific as to where they live. And the ornate day gecko that you see on the other side are also quite well adapted to human-built structures, rocks, and they are found in lower parts of the trees, but they also go higher up if there's no other species there. But the invasive species have actually impacted quite a lot on the distribution of many of these species. This particular species from Mauritius, called the Mauritius lowland forest day gecko, we couldn't even sample. And my collaborators, whom you can see here in the photographs, all of us tried a lot, and we would go back to some of the individuals that we had seen previously, but we could, not come up with a method that we could capture because this was so high up, and I had to use some kind of a zoom lens and capture this photo because this was the only thing I was going to get out of this species, and it is one of the more endangered species in Mauritius. And rest of the species we were able to sample and actually sample across different habitats in different parts of the island, thanks to the incredible knowledge of all my collaborators who are in this photograph. In the La Réunion Island, which is the neighboring island of Mauritius, another volcanic island. But La Réunion has an active volcano. It's a much younger volcanic island, so it has a higher gradient of elevation, going all the way from sea level to almost, I think, if I'm not wrong, 4,300 meters. The extinct volcano is that. But these geckos are not found so high up. They are still restricted to the lower parts. There's two endemic species in this island, but they do not really co-occur with one another. Their distributions have massively changed because of invasive species. The one you see here called the Madagascar giant day gecko is truly a giant gecko. And I don't think I've ever seen such a voracious predator that literally eats anything that fits its mouth. So one of the toughest things for us was to figure out, because the goal was to try and see how invasive species impact the native species. The idea was to get sites where you have both the native species and the invasive species to kind of measure the impact. But unfortunately, in Reunion, there were no sites, almost no sites, where they sort of overlapped more. Because once the invasion of this particular species and another species that is not photographed here are established, that the native geckos wouldn't even be around. They would be completely gone from that particular site. So this invasion is actually very, very, very highly threatening, because most of the sites where we detected the invasive species, we almost always fail to see endemic species, or we almost always fail to capture, because if there was one or two, they were so shy, they were so scared that it was almost impossible to capture and collect any data that we could use to measure the impact of invasive species. And we used several different methods to try and capture these day geckos, because unlike most of the herpetology or reptile biology, where people go turn stones, they find these fascinating organisms. Day geckos are the kind where you need binoculars, right? You can almost look like a birder, but you're not really a birder, you're looking at geckos. So capturing them is a whole different challenge. So we tried several different methods, and I have to say I truly enjoyed the process, but it was very, very painful because most of the time we did fail. This is the other endemic gecko of La Réunion, but this is critically endangered and is only found in this stretch of half to 1 kilometer stretch of beach in the southern part of the island. So any big natural calamity to that particular part, or a big cyclone, hurricane, something could actually really risk elimination of the species from the wild. Um, so, I mean, we try to collect as much ecological information about these organisms as possible. And we photograph them a lot. I mean, I don't really, as a skeptical person, I don't know how long the species could survive, but there are some really, really passionate people working to conserve this particular species and this particular habitat. And this patch of reunion is where I saw citizen science at its best. So people in this particular stretch of the beach, they're pretty well off. So they have these massive bungalows and private gardens, and so a lot of palm trees where these species can thrive. But the moment they saw invasive species of the day gecko, they would call this particular NGO, and there was this person who would go and eliminate the invasive species in whatever form he could as much as possible to make sure that these geckos are not impacted. Because the moment that invasive species took over a palm tree, these geckos would leave immediately. So it was a very time bound kind of a job. Unfortunately, one of the person doing this job, the one person below here in this photo, Thomas Russell, passed away in a marine accident. But I mean, it was really sad, but the kind of work that he did in that part of Ireland, the kind of dedication that I saw for the conservation of these tiny geckos was just mind blowing and very, very impressive. Moving on to the Comoros, which is on the other side of Madagascar, again, volcanic islands, but very different in terms of the habitat or the level of disturbance and the level of protection that the habitat has. Because here there's a lot of poverty, and people actually use forest resources quite extensively. They also plant banana trees in between so they can grow fast. It gets good rainfall, good shade, and people go often to the forest and collect the things that they grow. So I would say there's a lot of harmony, but also there's a lot of disturbance in the habitats. However, the two endemic species in this island were distributed in at least some of the parts that that were known, before. Like, so their ranges probably haven't contracted as much as some of the other islands. They do survive, and they do seem to have adapted to a level of human disturbance, probably slightly much better than the reunion day geckos. But this remains to be seen in the near future. This is just my hypothesis. And we collaborated with the Natural History Museum in the Grand Comoro and several students there whom we worked with for sampling. And it was very, very like the kind of work where we learned a lot from them about the local ecology, species interactions, and the cultural interactions with biodiversity. And these were some islands where we had a lot of stories to tell. Like, we got all our baguettes eaten by cows one night, and we didn't have any food in a camp. So we have a lot of exciting stories from this part. And we were able to successfully sample many of the populations with invasive species and without invasive species. And this work is underway. And as I said, so the Comoros have modified habitats, lots of plantations. So the sampling strategy was quite different. I would say a bit similar to the Andamans, because finding the Andaman day gecko in the forest is actually a big challenge. So most of our sampling was in plantations. And Comoros were more similar to that, unlike Mauritius and La Reunion. So these are some of the, the geckos species, the fascinating gecko species that I was studying, and I have been studying along with so many other people that I've hopefully mentioned most of them here. But if not all, there are a lot more people involved. But also, these geckos are not just ecologically interesting because of their adaptations in their diet and ecologies, but also they have evolved this ability to form structural coloration. So this green and blue that you see in day geckos are actually not chemical colors, it's structural colors. And the underlying chemical colors are just yellow and red, but due to the interaction with light and how the cells are arranged, they form this fascinating green and blue structures, color structures. And they use this patterning and colors in interactions, both interspecies interactions and within species interactions. Um, so they're very beautiful to watch, very nice to study, and lots of things remain to be studied in terms of their ecologies and how they could adapt to the changing climate in the near future. With this, I'd like to thank all the people who I've already mentioned in the presentation, but also additional collaborators who have taught me lots of new methods that we're applying to all the data that we've collected in these projects, and several institutions in addition to these institutions that I've mentioned, and funding agencies which played a very key role in providing me the opportunity to travel to these islands, form new collaborations and work with the people in the geckos on these islands. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. First of all, those are incredibly beautiful animals. I was really stunned by the images of all of them. We have a ton of questions from the audience, so I will just dive straight in. Let me see. One question here is whether anyone has investigated whether these island microadaptations are epigenetic, genetic, or a combination of both. Do you know that? Is that known?
Oh, no, that's actually a superb question. I mean, no, I don't think, at least as far as I know, I don't think there's any epigenetic studies in any of these day geckos or like tropical island gecko adaptations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's one. That is, Darwin argued that exposure to more competition on mainland continents versus islands means that island species are less highly evolved. Now, I think we'll probably have the same response to that kind of phrasing. But in terms of in terms of turnover and things like that, what do you think? Is there anything in that?
Sorry, Anjali, I lost. You were breaking a little bit, but
sorry. The museum Wi-Fi probably. It's whether island species evolve more quickly than continental species. I think there's questions there about like selection pressure and competition pressure. But I could also see an argument for why it could be the opposite. So is that borne out by your data?
I mean, it's true that island species are probably not as exposed to as many predators or the diversity of predators that mainland species are exposed to. But what do you mean highly evolved? I think it's a very subjective, what is higher than the other? Given enough time, given the survival abilities, island species also adapt and recognize predators. Like many of these islands that you go today where humans have been there for thousands of years, you see that island species are also equally, careful and shy when they recognize something foreign. That is not something that they generally interact with and recognize something as a predator.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Here's another question from the same person. If you remove a species from an ecosystem with several partitioned niches, would you anticipate the same partitioning to reemerge? So do patterns of niche partitioning repeat between islands? And you see convergence between certain communities of ecomorphs. This, of course, goes actually right back to Darwin's original ideas, right?
Yeah. And the anole example that I provided in the beginning of the presentation, these are from Lesser Antilles Islands in the Caribbean. And where's that image? Sorry. Almost there. Oops. Yeah. So here, the first vertical panel is of anoles from one island. The second vertical panel is of anoles from another island. But you can see how highly similar species are as they're adapted to the same or similar, almost identical ecological niche. So yes, it can converge and evolution can repeat itself across different islands. Has it happened with day geckos? Most likely no, at least from all the data that we have and the research that we have been doing. This is not the case with the day geckos. But it remains to be seen how their diets also would change or converge across different islands. Because some organisms like the anoles, they are able to change their morphologies so drastically to adapt to these microhabitats, but gecko morphology is much more conserved. So it's not very obvious when you see them. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let's see, I'm just trying to get through so many questions. They keep on popping up. Obviously, people have loved this talk. Okay, so here's one. Interesting as some invasive gecko species can coexist with endemic species in the same niche. In such cases, can you predict a tipping point that would cause either species to take over and drive out the other one?
Yeah, again, great question. With the day geckos themselves, I cannot probably say the exact tipping point, because again, it depends on which invasive species is the one driving out the native species, right? The interactions depend. So the giant Madagascar day gecko is a giant species, and that seems to push out native species much sooner compared to the other two smaller bodied species. But again, because a lot of this research and data collection is sort of an aftermath of what has already happened, that I think there are very few sites where you can actually observe on from the day of introduction to the day of elimination of the native species. So at least for day geckos, we don't have that kind of data. So I wouldn't be able to tell exactly. I couldn't give you a figure, but I think it's a very dependent thing based on what is the invasive species and how do the endemic species look like. If this is extremely large and this is a small species, for example, or this one can adapt everywhere and this cannot adapt everywhere, then it would be much faster compared to species that can adapt to change much quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if there's one that follows on that one well. Actually, there's a couple of questions just on how you actually do this work, which I think is interesting. There's so many questions popping up. Sorry if we don't get to all of them. So here's two related questions about how do you actually sample the geckos? Do you use a lasso? How do you get what part of how do you get the DNA samples? Do they ever drop their tails? And similarly, Arita asks if there's any standard to sample in these small reptiles, or if you just kind of is it opportunistic?
Oh yeah, all of them great questions. As I already mentioned somewhere, these geckos are very difficult to catch because they're visually very strong. They see very well, and because they also use colors, they're active during the day. They're very shy and they escape very quickly. But unlike other lizard groups that have a stronger body and stronger scales, geckos, they look like this, but they're very squishy. So we cannot really use lasso. Because it would cut them, or it would hurt the skin, or even it could even cut them properly. So we've tried quite a lot of methods, and I have to say we've mostly failed. We've been successful only because we're so persistent and don't give up. But so these are some of I put these photos together just in case someone asks this question. So we tried to put these kind of fake, I would say, tree holes by putting a hole inside a bamboo and tying it up to the tree, or putting these tiny pipes. Most of the times we didn't find anything inside it. So you're right, they do drop their tails. So in the Andamans especially, the one thing we would do is we would tap on the tree just beside the gecko. So it would get scared and it would drop the tail. So that's the DNA, right? I store that in 100% alcohol, come back to the lab, extract DNA. So it's the safest method, but it does cost the gecko the entire tail, which is not necessary for the DNA. I would just need a very small bit, but if you cannot capture them, this is the alternate strategy, because geckos regrow their tails, so that helps, even though it's energetically quite expensive.
It's a good trick though.
Yeah.
Okay, how about here's a question about, there's a couple questions about Nicobar. So one is that there's somebody clearly knows their area here. There's 3 Cryptodactylus species through the 3 groups of islands, but in Andaman it's only 1 is described. Do you think there are any more of the Cryptodactylus species in the Andaman Islands?
The Cryptodactylus, no. From our research, we know that the entire Andaman archipelago has a single species.
Okay. All right. Here's one from Marco. Do you find that large-scale climate change, i.e. sea level rise, will impact or is already impacting the diversity of geckos in these islands, or whether any new niches could arise as a result?
I honestly don't know the answer to this question. They're tropical islands. The weather could be getting more hot and extreme. Monsoons not arriving on time. Um, but how would it impact in terms of creation of new niches? I wouldn't be able to. No, I feel like at least in the current time in these islands, impact of habitat degradation and invasive species seem to have the highest impact on losing ranges of species. So species are contracting to smaller ranges because of human-driven impacts more so than anything else at this point. I think for to get an idea of an impact of climate change, I, I'm not aware of any research that has been done, but I have a feeling that there's not much that's been done at least.
Okay. Obviously going to be increasingly important.
Yeah.
Okay, and here's one. There's a couple here about just as a biogeography, actually. So one, I'm noting that there's that kind of the commonality between the relationships of the dodo and the Nicobar, the close relationship between the dodo and the Nicobar pigeon, and then obviously what you've shown here with these things from Madagascar. There's also a question here about whether you were able to come to any specific inference on the reasons for why they are in the Andaman Islands, given their close relatives are from the Western Indian Ocean volcanic islands. This also reminds me of some of our paleontological work from the Cretaceous, where the a lot of the Indian vertebrates that we find in South India are actually most closely related to things in Madagascar. But of course, back then it made a lot more sense because they were right next to each other. Yeah, if you go back 80 million years.
Yeah. I mean, there's several hypotheses. Unfortunately, that we have no fossil record of any extinct day geckos in Indian subcontinent or the surrounding islands where nothing is found today. So we could hypothesize that they probably used these landmasses as skipping stones and ended up in Andamans, where that particular niche of being active during the day and being green in color and arboreal was probably empty, and they adapted and survived. Whereas in other parts, for example, if you think about the Indian subcontinent, it already has a huge diversity of geckos and other groups of reptiles that could take over the same niche, as well as, like another person pointed out, a lot more predators. So probably they didn't survive, but all of this is a hypothesis. Probably they never reached the subcontinent, and it was just a long distance overseas dispersal event. It's one of these rare overseas dispersal events that could go for thousands of kilometers if you have an entire patch of forest or something that was cut off due to extreme climatic events. But again, all hypotheses because we don't have any backing with any fossils and nothing such.
Yeah.
But one thing to highlight is, as I mentioned before, when the sea level was lower during the glaciation cycle, there were exposed land masses in between that are not exposed anymore. So even if they had played some kind of role to aid dispersal to such a long distance, there's no trace today, but that's a possibility as well.
Okay. Great. Let's see. I think we got through all of them. There were, like I said, quite a lot here, but that's good because we are actually just slightly over time here. Okay, I think we can end there then. So let people get back to their busy work days. Thank you so much, Ashwini. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. Really, really lovely study system. And just before we finish, I hope all of you who have joined us online have enjoyed this talk, and I hope we'll see you at some of the future Linnaean Society events. The next one we have coming up is actually just this Friday, in person and also online, at the Linnaean Society Burlington House, on the roots of ethno-ornithology, knowing and naming birds. We have treasure tours and a Valentine's tour, quiz, and drinks reception in early February, and then also in early February, we have a talk on smoke and ashes, opium's hidden histories, as well as many more events coming up. So please do take a look on our site, and I hope to see many of you at our next event. Thank you all, and thank you, Ashwini. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.